From Oathbreakers to Lawful Stupid and everything in between, and from legends to reality, let us talk about Paladins. Have you ever wondered where Paladins come from? What is their origin, their story, and how come they are present in most, if not all, medieval fantasy settings? Well, this is where I come in, so stick around and together we'll try and figure out where our beloved armored oaths come from. Hello everyone, Funky Monkey here, welcome to today's episode. Today's video continues the series where I explain the various classes available in TTRPGs and most MMORPGs, and seeing how the new Dungeons & Dragons movie, Honor Among Thieves, is not that far off, my plan is to eventually cover all classes one might find in fantasy games. I will first cover the classes that appear in the movie and then expand to other classes one might be able to play in fantasy games. Actually, this is my second video in the series. The first one covered my favorite class in TTRPGs, the Bard. Link is right over there. I also plan to continue and finish painting Borborygmos, a paint job that I started last week. If you haven't seen that video, make sure you do so. It touches upon New Year celebrations. Also, as a disclaimer for this video, I want to apologize in advance for mispronouncing names and places. Most will be in French, and although I studied French in my youth, I haven't spoken the language in over 18 years. Now, before we start the journey, let me tell you what my plans for this miniature are. You just smite that like button, and once you are done with this video, make sure you check out TW Creative -cats for more cat adventures that have nothing to do with history, but a lot to do with cat adventures. Now let's go to the mini. With the skin painted on last week's episode, I will now have to focus on everything else. What have I gotten myself into? The plan is quite simple. The armor and furs will be dark brown. I will try and make the bones that adorn Borborygmos' armor look very old and bleached, and I will go for the box art and make his mane red, and then I will finish everything up by painting the weapon a bluish grey. The painting process is going to be a little bit more difficult because I don't have a handle sturdy enough to use with this miniature, so I will have to handle it directly. This way I need to be careful how I hold the miniature, because although I already varnished the skin, I still don't want to run the risk of rubbing paint off. That would be a disaster, as I don't have the paint mixture used for the skin on hand anymore. For that reason alone, I also need to be a little bit more careful when applying the paint in general, as I cannot repair the skin. A new lesson learned. I will start with the armor and then move on to the bones and mane, finishing with the weapon and the base. With that out of the way, let's go through the checklist. I don't have any coffee today because it is quite late, but I do have some very lovely tropical fruit tea in my mousse cup, and I have some homemade, by yours truly, coffee liqueur that substitutes the coffee and soothes the soul. I also have my lovely assistant right over there to accompany us through our journey. How about you? All comfy? Perfect. Then I think it's time for a story. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to Paladins, and we will have to seemingly diverge from the topic, but bear with me. It will all make sense in the end when everything comes together. As I've mentioned at the start of the video, Paladins can be found in most, if not all, medieval fantasy settings. But where do they come from? Are there any Paladins known to history? They are too well described not to be inspired by reality, don't you agree? Then let's start digging. First, the word Paladin. Where does it come from? Essentially, it comes from the Latin word Palatinus or Palatini, and this comes from one of the 7 hills Rome was built upon, the Palatine Hill. In essence, it translates as of the palace. Palatinus was the word used to describe some of the closest retainers of a Roman emperor. These individuals lived in the imperial residence as part of the Roman emperor's household, and the title and position survived and continued evolving in the kingdoms that followed, that rose after the fall of Rome. The title used in subsequent kingdoms was Comes Palatinus, and the bearer was the assistant to the king in his judicial or military or even administrative duties. As time passed, and given the status of these individuals, these Comes Palatini, in royal households, they were entrusted with important tasks, and the bearers of these titles were later sent to different parts of the kingdoms as judges and administrators. even governors. Eventually, by the middle of the Middle Ages, so to speak, the term comes evolved to count, and it comes with different perks and different obligations in relation to the royal court. But as you already know the drill, it's another story for another time, as there is much to say about dukes and counts and barons and everything in between. So, from Comes Palatinus we get count and paladin. Now let's focus on paladins. As time passed and the Franks expanded their territory, they kept the Latin title of Palatinus, and it ended up also meaning the mayor of the palace. This was a position very close to the king. Okay, this is a thread that we can follow, so let's do so. Why is it important that this title is for the Frankish mayor of the palace, and who the heck were the Franks? Okay, we have some questions, let's take them one by one. But first let's go back a little bit and ask ourselves, are there any actual mentions of paladins in the history? Actually there are. The 12 paladins, or the 12 peers. These were 12 legendary knights of Charlemagne's court in the 8th century. Now let's turn our attention to the Franks. Who were they? After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE, there was a power void left in its wake. After the dust settled a little bit, the Roman society in the provinces of the empire wanted, of course, to continue with their lives, as it is normal. So they started reorganizing. At first they tried to continue living as Romans, continue with their ways, but this wasn't really sustainable. The empire was gone, the administration was not really there anymore, the legions were gone, and they were left to fend for themselves. Numerous small kingdoms and centers of power rose to fill that void, some more successful than others, with local Roman administrators and commanders becoming small kings and warlords keeping a semblance of organization and trying to keep their way of life going. Of course, I am trying to condense the span of a few hundred years to the bare minimum of information so that you get the picture. Things were much more complicated than that, I hope you realize. It took about 200 to 300 years, but the first notable entity to rise and really replace the Roman Empire was the Frank Empire under the Carolingian dynasty. In what is now France. This is where the name of the country actually comes from. Franks, France, you get it. Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, who established the dynasty in 768 CE, was the first king of the Franks. He conquered the Lombards in northern Italy and conquered the Romans in 800. He re-established a dominant power in Western Europe that stretched from France to parts of Spain, to Switzerland, to Italy, to parts of Germany, and included the Netherlands. He also became the defender of the papacy, and he was crowned in Rome as Roman Emperor on Christmas Day in 800 CE by Pope Leon III. He was called Pater Europa, or Father of Europe, as he was the first to really reunite most of Western Europe after the collapse of the Roman Empire a few hundred years before. The Byzantines didn't really like him that much because of a set of religious reasons, and because the Pope supported him and recognized him as a ruler, crowning him as emperor instead of recognizing the first empress of the Byzantine Empire, Irene of Athens. This was mostly because of religious reasons and for practical reasons. Charlemagne conquered Italy. It would have been wiser for the Pope to recognize his authority and not rely on Irene of Athens, the empress of the Byzantine Empire. Charlemagne, by the way, is actually the anglicized version of Charlemagne, Charles the Great. And his name, Charles, Karol, or Karl, as it was pronounced in the Germanic languages, is also the origin of the word king in much of Europe. Polish use król, Ukrainian have korol, Turkish have kral, and so on. This title evolved in parallel to that of Caesar that eventually gave us Kaiser and Tsar. As you can see, this guy was actually a very big deal in medieval Europe. He died in 814 of a lung infection. With the knowledge of who Charlemagne was and who the Franks were, let's talk about his 12 peers. But before we do so, let us take a short break and talk about the miniature. With the armor and adornments done, it is time to give him a fiery mane. I am using Evil Sun's Scarlet as a base for his hair, and after 2 good coats I can come in with highlights. For the highlights I am using Arial Yellow. I will combine the yellow with the red to create an intermediary orange tone, otherwise the transition between the red and the yellow would be too stark. Don't get me wrong, maybe he got his hair done trying to go for blonde highlights, but I doubt it. He went more towards a balayage. Apparently I'm talking about hair dyeing techniques now. I need to focus on the miniature. While the base coat of the hair is drying, I'm tidying up the areas that I got some red on. Oh, what a joy. Moving on. Okay, the 12 Paladins. They were extensively mentioned in the 11th century, so 300-400 years after they lived. And they were portrayed as a bulwark of Christianity against the Muslim incursions in Europe. The number 12 is symbolic for Christians and they represented chivalry and everything that Christianity stood for. They were led by the noble Roland. They also had the same role as the Knights of the Round Table in the Arthurian legends. These individuals were very close to the king, part of his retinue, advisors and friends, and thus, as explained before, they were called Paladins. The Paladins came to be seen as the apogee of chivalry and nobility after the Battle of Roncevaux Pass in August 778. But what actually happened? The Franks under Charlemagne were ambushed by a Basque army as they were crossing the Pyrenees from Spain back to France after waging war against Muslims in Spain. This ambush was set up in retaliation for Charlemagne's destroying the walls of the Basque capital, Pamplona, leaving it defenseless. He also ordered the looting and razing of several local settlements, and he treated the Basques brutally and without any mercy. On the night of August 15, 778, the Basques attacked Charlemagne's army and caught them completely off guard. As you might imagine, there was a lot of confusion. Commanders found it very hard to organize their soldiers and organize a defense in the darkness. No one understood who the enemy was or where they were coming from. The Basques, on the other hand, being masters of guerrilla wars and knowing the terrain, managed to force the Frank army to flee. The rear guard was completely cut off from the main army, but they stood their ground, holding the Basques back and giving enough time to Charlemagne and the rest of the army to retreat. The whole rear guard was slain by the ambushers, including Roland and Egihart, mayor of the palace. Thus, they were elevated to legends by sacrificing themselves and allowing the king and the rest of the army to escape. Troubadours and poets sang their praises and made sure their deeds were known throughout the ages. As you can see, we eventually got to the mayor of the palace, or the Palatinus, a very high rank in Charlemagne's court. The mayor of the palace was among those who stood their ground and allowed the king to escape, as was his oath. And to be frank, pun intended, Egihart is a pretty good name for a paladin, if you want to troll your GM, of course. And you can always argue that it is historically accurate. This was one of the legendary paladins. Their sacrifice was the inspiration for the code of chivalry in the Middle Ages. The most important source that talks about Roland and his deeds is the Song of Roland, written somewhere between 1040 and 1115 CE. The 12 paladins, as listed in the Song of Roland, were Roland himself, Oliver, Guerin, Guerrier, Bengir, Othon, Samson, Engelier, Yvon, Ivar, Anse, and Girard. But besides these paladins, besides Roland's companions, there were other important members of the imperial household, such as Archbishop Turpin, Ogier the Dane, Huon of Bordeaux, Fierabras, Renaud de Montauban, and Ganelon. They were also considered paladins. They were part of the imperial households. They were the king's or the emperor's companions. But apparently Ganelon betrays all of them, breaking the oath he took to serve the king, to die protecting the king. His betrayal led to the death of Roland and the others. And so, we also get an oathbreaker paladin, perhaps the first in history. As mentioned before, the number 12 is very important and symbolic for Christians. It is reminiscent of the 12 apostles. And later, of course, as you might expect, their stories and legends changed. Before long, instead of them fighting against the Basques, they died fighting Muslims. They were mentioned in later sources as retrieving holy relics stolen from Rome by the Saracen or Muslims. They are said to have accompanied Charlemagne on a pilgrimage to Constantinople and Jerusalem. Fierabras was initially a Muslim, a Saracen, who converted to Christianity and joined the group. They were, in essence, portrayed as badasses. Their story was included in the Chansons de Geste, or Songs of Poetic Deeds, the earliest poems belonging to the epic style that appeared in France. Shortly after these kind of poems came to be, troubadours and troubadours also became very common and popular in France and in Europe in general. And so, the poems about Roland and his companions spread throughout Europe and evolved. Everybody embellished the stories of the 12 Paladins. By the way, troubadours and troubadouresses were medieval bards, more or less. But if you want a deeper dive in the history of bards, the link is right over there, so don't be shy, go and check it out, you might enjoy it. Let's go back to the legends. After they were made into the legends, the French remained so enthralled with the stories of the Paladins that they made sure that stories kept popping up in medieval French literature and throughout the Renaissance, so in the 15th and the 16th century. But the stories got more and more embellished and crazier with fantastical elements. They are mentioned as going on incredible quests and accomplishing awe-inspiring feats of strength, all the while remaining bastions of chivalry, morality, courage and faith. And with that, you might think that we kinda reached the end. We followed the threads that we had and we got to the bottom of who the Paladins were and where they came from. But as I am sure you are already aware, history is not that simple and things are always intertwined. So let's go to the miniature and we'll come back to dig a little bit deeper, wrap things up and tease the next episode. Before we go to the miniature, just as a fun fact because I can't help myself, the Roncevaux Pass is a traditional route between France and Spain over the Pyrenees, and it is the ancient Roman road Via ab Asturica Burdigalam. I have a video on Roman roads and roads in general, the evolution, the oldest roads known to humanity and so on and so forth. So if you're curious about roads and itineraries and milestones and everything, you know the drill, links are right over there. Now, let's go to the miniature. Finally, the weapon. Over the zenithal priming I came in with Incubi Darkness as a base for the weapon. Once that was done, I went in with a mixture of Incubi Darkness and Administratum Grey. I am wet blending the colors directly on the weapon and not on my wet palette. This is risky, especially since I haven't mastered the technique just yet, but I am risking it so I could get some more XP faster. I am jumping from spot to spot as you can see, and I am turning the weapon on all sides. I am very pleased with the results. I feel that it is coming along nicely, and with the dark tan robes holding it together, perfect. Too bad that in the end I messed everything up with a black wash that covered almost every detail. I could have applied it the other way around. The way I did it, I added too much shadow on the part facing the light. Another lesson learned the hard way. Anyway, let's wrap things up. Now that we know the origin of Paladins and what sparked the legends, we need to acknowledge the impact that they had on history and fantasy. We can't just leave it like that. They were the inspiration, the origin, but most definitely they were not the end of the story. With the code of chivalry and with the Paladins as a reference point, the Middle Ages saw the rise of new knightly orders that bared the torch further. With the Crusades, these knightly orders came to prominence and became the new bastions of chivalry. The Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitallers, and the Teutons are among the best known orders, but they are by far the only ones. To strengthen the ties with the Paladins of legend, all legendary knights, the symbols of chivalry, were also called Paladins. Legendary individuals such as King Arthur and his noble knights of the Round Table, they were all Paladins. The knightly orders that rose during the Crusades embodied the definition of Paladins for their particular age. They protected the weak, they cared for the sick, they helped those in distress, they defended pilgrims, and most importantly, for that age, they did all of this in the name of God, Christ, and the Holy Spirit. They were, for all intents and purposes, holy warriors who would use divine powers to smite their foes and implicitly those of the Christian world. I think this is the best moment to end this video, as we've explained the origin of Paladins. Next time we'll wrap up our story by talking about the knightly orders of the High Middle Ages that were inspired by the 12 Paladins who served Charlemagne. Make sure you smite that like button as if you were a holy warrior and it was a servant of darkness, and show me that you found some inspiration. Smite that subscribe button as well to make sure that you never miss my videos, and leave the bell on. You will always be notified whenever a new video comes out. Thanks. And with that, I want to thank you for the privilege of your time, and I hope you found some inspiration and learned something new. I can't wait to see you all here next time on Funky Monkey MP, the place where you get your dose of miniature painting, history and world building, and trivia. Remember, always be curious, learn from the past, look towards the future, live in the now, and always keep world building and creating. Your mind is wonderful. Cheers.